Abhik Singhi, Mr. Sumit Mazumdar, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. The $10 trillion prize, winning the $10 trillion prize in China and in India. The rapidly changing consumption patterns, demands, needs of two of the fastest growing economies is certainly going to impact and transform the world. What makes them tick? What are some of their differences yet similarities? This evening session is going to give you a glimpse, some interesting insights into what are some of the faces behind the facts. It's going to raise some questions, and it's going to invite you to meet your new global consumer. Abhik Singhi, we really appreciate him. He had to juggle a lot of things in his calendar to be with us today in Kolkata, so really appreciate that, Abhik. And I'm particularly proud to have him as part of Aspen India's Young Leaders Program, the India Leadership Initiative, and also a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So very proud of that. Abhik has, and I do need to read out a couple of things on Abhik before I hand it over. Abhik has more than 15 years of experience in consulting in India, Asia, and North America. He is the partner and director of the Boston Consulting Group, where he leads the consumer and retail practice in Asia Pacific. He's been a member of the National FMCG Committee and the National Trade Committees of CII. Abhik is a co-author of the $10 trillion prize, and he's also co-authored several seminal reports on the Indian consumer and retail sectors. Some of them include The Tiger Roars, Building a New India, and Agribusiness, Cultivating New Opportunities, among several others. So delighted to have you with us, Abhik. Mr. Sumit Mazumdar needs little introduction in Kolkata, and certainly not in Bengal Club, but I'm going to provide one anyway. And he's told me to make it in one sentence, so that's going to be really hard, but I will try.
We agreed on 1.5.
Okay, 1.5 it is then. As many of you know, Mr. Mazumdar is currently the Vice Chairman and Managing Director of TIL. He's also currently the Vice President of CII, having been past Chairman of Eastern Region. And he has many other roles which he kind of plays. Past member of ASSOCHAM, a director on WBIDC, and advisory board of Calcutta Business School, amongst many others. So that was a little more than 1.5 sentences, but over to you, Mr. Mazumdar.
You want me to come up there?
Wherever you have other mics.
Ritushri, thank you very much. First of all, I must thank you and the Aspen Institute for organizing this today. It's given me a chance to meet Abhik Singhi, and you said he's been practicing for 15 years. Did you graduate, or did you just start practicing? But I've really been looking forward to meeting you. We have, as we discussed, we have common friends. So I was gifted your book, and I could see from the book that you're a very young man, and I said this must be really interesting. So when Ritushri invited me, I readily accepted. I was just having a chat with Abhik over there while everyone was having tea, and I said, I do admit I haven't read your book fully, but I have glanced through your book, and I had it at home, and my wife was glancing through the book, and the comment she made was, this is very simple and written in a very simple and interesting way. And to that he replied, he says, when we wrote the book, our publisher said, write the book in such a way that two things must happen. One is, once you start reading it, people shouldn't want to put it down, it should be so interesting. And second is, it shouldn't take more than 2.5 hours to finish the book, because that's the average travel time on the plane in India. And people normally read these books when they're on the plane. And I'd say you've achieved both. it's interesting because they're talking about this is very different from any other book that you read on India and China. And I dare say a lot of books have been written on India and China. What they've done for the first time is the book focuses on the vital force that will transform these countries and these economies in the next decade. And we're talking about the new consumers, the new middle class, and the growing middle class. Without going into figures, they have projected that by 2020, in the next decade, the consumer spend will increase threefold in China and 3.5-fold in India. And they've actually given figures like to the last decimal point of how much the spend in China will be and how much the spend in India will be. China, they're saying, is going to be $6,187 billion, and in India is going to be $3,584 billion. I'd really be very interested to know how you can come at such exact figures. You know, we go through the budgeting process every year, and not only we are far away, we never have such exact figures. It also gives a message to manufacturers of consumer goods and providers of service that the new market and the market they should concentrate on is India and China, because this is where it's going to happen. But under no circumstances is this going to lower the position in the Western world. This is going to be in addition to that. And they've also said in this book that their experience in China and India is going to have a rub-off effect on their own markets and grow their own markets further. He's got certain points that are key messages in the book. I won't go over that. I think it's more important that we listen to what he has to say, and then we can, have a dialogue, or we can open up for questions. But we really come here to listen to you a week, so I'm going to hand it over back to you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I have a couple of confessions to make. The first, when you referred around the 15 years, so I actually have some very fond and some not so fond memories of Calcutta. So the first time that I earned a single penny was actually in Calcutta. This was in 93, 94. I was doing my internship, engineering internship at Hindustan Lever Garden Reach. And I was staying at IIM Calcutta, and I used to take Baro C to Garden Reach. And for those of you who know of the bus situations in Calcutta would appreciate that I would get up in the morning, get ready, and in the night I would have ironed my shirt, and then I would get into the bus, and by the time I got off, it used to be a very different me. So that was the not so pleasant memory, but I think the pleasant part was the fact that the joy of earning your first rupee was something that I actually experienced in Calcutta, and therefore it's great to be here and talking to this group. The first thing that I'd like to clarify is I would really encourage this to be a discussion. So, it's despite what anybody may think, I think I would take this to say that I think this is not the last word on India and China. I think this is just the beginning of a conversation. There are many books that have been written about China and India, and I think one of the things that many of them have got wrong is the fact that they try to be the authentic book on either of these countries. And the fact is that there is so much change which is happening in both these countries, both these societies, both these economies, that it is very difficult for anyone except maybe God to have a view on what's really going to happen. So really to think of this as the beginning of a conversation rather than the last word on these two markets. When I told my publisher that I'm going to be coming here and I'm going to be talking to a group, so the only thing which he said was, you need to make sure that you tell them enough about the book that it piques their interest, but you don't tell them so much that they don't buy a copy. So, I'm going to try to strike that balance. But before I get into it, here is and there's a few pictures and slides. So the economist is said to be the definitive word on whatever is happening. So if you so something has stopped working. So
let's take those.
So what you see on the left hand side is what the Economist cover was sometime in 2008, World on the Edge, and then now as you look at it, is the worst really over? Because at one end, one is everybody's talking about things are fine, and this is more to just provide a context that the time that we were actually doing the research on this book, which was 2010 and 11, it was actually a time of doom and gloom. Everybody said that the world is coming to an end, or it has already come to an end. And what was very fascinating for us was, as we were on the ground in China, in India, we actually did not see too many signs of that. So the question was, is there a lot of optimism which was there earlier was misplaced, or is the pessimism which is happening today that's misplaced? And my personal view is, we and the media tend to swing on both sides too much. So earlier this year, the Mint asked me just before the budget was coming out to say, write an article on what you think is going to happen in the consumer economy. So I'm deliberately, blanked out the title, and I said I'm actually fairly optimistic about what's going to happen, because I believe that from a consumption perspective, it's going to be positive. The consumer sentiment is still high. People are still going out and buying. They're not buying as much as they were buying a year back, but there is a reason to believe there is a long-term potential. Last year has been a mixed bag, and if you look at, you can't talk about it at a generic level. What happens, let's say, in the auto sector is very different from what happens in durable, what happens in FMCG. So you can't say, it's all fine or it's all bad. And the two things that I said, I'm going to determine what's going to happen in 2013-14 is going to be a function of interest rates and inflation, the two I's. I was really surprised when I saw the title, because that is what the editor decides, facing partial paralysis. And I got a set of emails and calls from friends and colleagues saying, you keep on saying that you are optimistic, and then you write an article about paralysis. So I said, have you actually read what is there in the article? They said, no, but the title says it all. So why am I talking about it is the fact that if I look at the title of the book, it is around the $10 trillion price, and to the point that Mr. Mazumdar was saying, how we were so accurate around the 6187 and the numbers for India. I think the short answer is, we actually came out with a number of 9.8 trillion, and the publisher said, yeah, how does it matter whether it is 10 or 9? It's a big enough number. Is everybody going to be really disappointed whether it is 9 or 10? The fact is that in the history of mankind, and this is on a more serious note, in the history of mankind, never before have so many people moved from a level of such low income to medium income ever. We are talking about close to 1 billion people who are going to move from less than $2,000 per year to somewhere around $4,000 per year. Never before in the history of mankind has this happened. The only period which is comparable is what happened in the US in the period 1870 to 1910. That's the only period ever that you would find anything even remotely similar happening. And the interesting thing is, even if you look at that time period, there were times where there were ups and downs. So if you look at the period between 1870 and 1910, you actually had, for example, in 1873, the silver crisis, where the price of most of the commodities actually fell within a period of 2 months by 60-odd%. So I think the journey, as one thinks about China, India, it's not that it's going to be all secular growth. There are going to be bumps down the road. So this is the caveat in terms of saying what is going to be different. And I think what's going to be different is the fact that I'm an engineer, so I'm just going to use this phrase. if you look at momentum, it is mass times velocity. And in the case of these two countries, we actually have both mass and velocity, which are coming together for the first time ever. And what is the key driver of that? As Mr. Mazumdar said, it is the consumer. And if you look at all the books which had been written, so when we started writing this, one of the questions was, oh God, why another book about India and China? Chindia had come, and there were literally 25 odd books which had been written about the economy, many of them in the same vein. Half of them were talking about how it's going to be boom, the other half were talking about how it's going to be bust. So what's going to be new, different? And what we found was many of the books talked about the infrastructure, talked about the economics, talked about the macro factors, but really nobody talked about the prime mover behind all of this. In India's case, it has always been the case that consumption is really driving the growth of the economy. In China, it was investment initially, but if you look at what's happening right now, it's actually much more on the consumption side. And therefore, we painted the picture not only in terms of numbers and statistics, but in terms of the stories. And what I'd like to do today also is share a few facts, but more importantly, share a few stories which were at one end inspirational and on the other end quite reflective of what's happening in the environment today. So, the first part, and I'd really like to spend most of that talking about a few stories and a few facts. So if there is one fact that you take away from today's discussion, is this. So imagine a child born in the year 2009. That child, over her lifetime, will consume roughly $275,000 worth in the entire lifetime. Now, there are some assumptions that we are making. We are assuming that this child is going to live till the age of 64. Maybe by the time that she grows up, the life expectancy would increase, and therefore it's going to be slightly higher. Per capita consumption at the time of birth was about 800. By the time that she dies, it is going to be about 6,200. This actually assumes that the growth rate beyond 2020 actually falls to 4%. So we will not see the 6, 7, 8, whatever. So in some sense, it is conservative. Now, if you compare that with what her grandparents consumed, it was actually about 20 times less. So if you compare a child who was born in 2009 versus somebody who was born in 1960, there is a 19x increase in consumption over the lifetime. And this is in real rupee terms. So this is adjusting for inflation. So this does not take into account the fact that you're actually having inflation as well. This is pure consumption increase which is happening. Now this looks impressive till you actually look at what happens in China. So the number in China is exactly double. So we're talking about 38 times increase. And just to be clear, I am at no point of time advocating that this is only good. There are implications of the same that we've talked about as to what is the implication of the same on the environment. What is the implication of that on pollution? Is there likely to be a war over water? And so on. So it's not only good news that there is an increased consumption, but it is a fact that there is going to be consumption at a scale which is unsurpassed in human history. And what makes it particularly striking is the fact that it is happening in a very compressed time period. It's happening in a very, very compressed time period. If you look at history of most nations, it takes about 100 years or 50 years for this kind of a growth to happen. The fastest ever before that something like this has happened is in the case of Singapore, where it took about 50 years for the same increase, but Singapore is really a city. So at this scale, we've never seen something like this happen. So this is the one fact just to keep in mind what happens. And this is the point that I'd really like to share. So this is a set of characters who are there in the book. One of my co-authors is an American. He had heard a lot about IIT and he really wanted to meet somebody who was from IIT. So the two of us went to the IIT Delhi campus and we met this young man that you see on the left with a goatee. You know, he was around 20 years old at that time. Sriram is his name, and my colleague insisted on calling him Mr. Number 19 because he was number 19 in the IIT joint entrance exam. And what was really interesting about Sriram was the fact that if you look at his early life, you could have never imagined that he would actually make it to this place. But he has received help from, you know, what I would say the kindness of strangers in some sense, which has actually made this possible. And his extent of self-belief, you know, one of the phrases that struck with us was the fact that, you know, we were asking him, you know, what do you want to do? And he said, you know, I can do anything. And he said, you know, I have not decided exactly what I want to do, but the moment I decide what I want to do, I know that I can do that. And, you know, my colleague then took me aside and he said, you know, were you this confident or cocky when you were at IIT? And I said, no, I was not, because I think that generation did not have that degree of self-confidence. And what really strikes for me as I have met different people in India and China is the degree of confidence which is there amongst people. 10 years back, it was lesser. 20 years back, I always remember a self of diffidence which was there. And that's one thing which strikes out across most of the characters that we met with. The second person that I'd like to talk about is the lady farmer, Wix Liu, that you see on the left-hand side. So she lived in a village about 3 hours drive from Beijing. The first time that I had met her was in the summer of 2007. I was doing some project and I had met her, and at that point of time, her situation was not very good. But one of the things that she had started doing was she had changed from growing wheat to growing corn because that offered a higher income. And she had started doing that, and you know, the next time I met her was in 2011, and you know, she was constructing her house, which you can see in the background. And one of the remarkable things was, as she was constructing her house, in the living room, she had left 2 ducts open. And you know, through the translator, we just asked her, you know, why is it that you have these ducts there? So she said, you know, 2 years from now, I'm going to have air conditioners here. She did not have the money at that point of time, but she had the belief that she would do it. Earlier this year, I had gone to Beijing and again went to see, and lo and behold, there were 2 air conditioners in her house, and she now started construction of a garage outside her house because the next step was to buy a car. And one of the questions that people ask is, you know, what is the difference, similarity between India, China, etc.? And I think the 2 things that stand out for me, number one is the sense of positive energy which is there. So one of the things that we do is every year do a survey of close to 25,000 people all across the world, and one of the questions, fairly simple, is to say, you know, do you believe your life is going to be better or worse in 10 years' time? Close to 80% of Indian and Chinese believe that their lives are going to be better. The number for US, UK is 25%. 75% believe that their life is going to be worse in 10 years. If you look at the worst performing, it's actually the Mediterranean ring, Spain, Greece, Italy. If you look at them, less than 20% believe their lives are going to be better in 10 years' time. So it is the sense of hope and optimism, number one. Number two, and I think that's very important, is the importance to education. In both countries, the amount of time, effort, energy that parents are willing to spend on education for their kids, because that's what they see as the lifeline for the future, is unbelievable. And to my mind, those are the two biggest similarities between the two countries. Earlier this year, I took a sabbatical for some time, and I went traveling in rural India for 20 days. So I spent some time, 5 days in Gujarat, then 5 days Bihar, then Rajasthan, and then eastern UP. And the biggest surprise to me, especially in places like UP and Rajasthan, was the fact that the importance that I saw in rural India today, given on education, given on insistence to making sure that the kids actually attend school, I had not imagined that. So close to 95% of the people that I met send their kids to school. Everyone who could afford to send their kids to the best possible school which was there. And to my mind, if somebody was to ask me what is it that I am optimistic about India, I think that's what makes me optimistic. I'll talk in a little while about what makes me pessimistic as well. So, this to my mind is the A, B, C, D, E of the risks. So, number one probably is more relevant to China. Asset bubbles, I think everybody's been talking about that for ages. For some reason it doesn't happen. My personal view is it's unlikely to happen because of a set of structural factors, but that is a risk which is there. Bureaucracy and corruption, and interestingly, they are as big an issue in China as they are in India. So it's not that we have the monopoly on these two. I think this is another thing that we share with our neighbors. Disasters, both man-made and natural. So the kind of pollution that we are seeing, the kind of environmental impact that we are seeing, that could lead to a disaster waiting to happen. So one of the things that in one of the talks, one of the youngsters asked me is saying, these are all the known risks which are there. What would you call the black swan? And I was flummoxed for a minute because I think it's a great question. To my mind, the black swan in China, and that's something which I could identify, is imagine you are living in a society where you've not had a sibling. Imagine you don't have cousins as well. And that's a reality for close to 80% of Chinese. They don't have a sibling. Many of their parents did not have a sibling. So you actually have a situation where you are self-centered. I'm not saying you're selfish. You're self-centered. What could be the potential implications of that? To be honest, I don't know. It could be positive, it could be negative, but that's something, again, we have never seen ever happening before. So we have a situation from a purely economic perspective. Many of the Chinese analysts or people who cover China talk about it as the little emperor, little empress syndrome. So the Microsoft guys actually drew this. They drew two sticks, and they drew two sticks. They drew two sticks below that, and they said, you have two grandparents here, two grandparents here. You have two parents, so you have 6 people taking care of one person. Great, because then you can lavish all your love, money, affection on that individual. Let's fast forward a few years later. You actually don't have social security. How would one individual who's always been used to be taken care of going to take care of 6 individuals, right? So that to my mind is the black swan. What could be the black swan for India? I think there are so many risks that we keep on talking about India. So in some sense, every risk is already factored in, but I'm sure we are missing something. And maybe because I'm so much a part of the Indian system itself that I can't see it, but I'm sure there is something that we are not seeing itself. So that's, in some sense, the prize, and the issue which, especially from a corporate perspective, is, so here is a large market, great, let's go and win in that. I have a question for everybody in this room. If you can, name some company or companies that are successful in both the Chinese and Indian market. And my definition of success is, and there's no scientific logic behind it, is to say they need to be at least $500 million revenue, and they need to be making money. Right? So, Apple. Huawei, okay. Pepsi actually does not make money in either country. But, yeah. Unilever, very successful in India, not so successful in China. Not that scale in India.
KFC.
Again, hugely successful China, not that level in India. Sony. I'm sorry? See, the interesting thing is, if you actually go down the list, there are actually many multinational companies who are operating in both markets. The companies which actually are successful on that dimension, somebody mentioned Samsung. So that's one example which is actually of significant scale in both countries and profitable. If you look at everybody else, whether you look at a Coke or a Pepsi or a Unilever or a P&G or a L'Oreal or any of the car companies, you go down the list, there are very, very few companies who have been successful in both markets. There are some who have been successful in one and not in the other, but very, very few who actually have managed to win in both markets. And the question then arises, is this prize for real? And what's really the key to winning in these markets? So I think the first piece is around diversity. And the reason I put this page up is because, so this is the google.co.in, right? You go to any country's site of Google, you will not find a page like this, right? And the reason is what you see at the bottom. Google.co offered in Hindi, Bengali, Telugu, Marathi, Tamil, Gujarati, Kannada, Malayalam, Punjabi. No other country would you find the country page of Google offering this much diversity. So there is diversity in terms of language, which is in some sense unique to India, but you actually find flavors of the same in China. For us, and at least personally for me, it was a revelation that at one level, you actually have equal diversity, whether in terms of economics, whether it is in terms of cultural factors, even in China. As an outsider, my perspective was, there's this vast monolith where, somebody from Beijing says something and everything gets done. Actually, on the ground, there is much greater diversity, whether it's in terms of food habits, whether it is in terms of architecture, whether it is terms of culture, whether it's terms of economics. So the fact is that most companies, when they think about India or China, they would say, oh, we have to win in India. We have to win in China. I haven't heard anybody saying that, oh, we have to win in North America. We have to win in Europe. You think about market by market by market. Even if you think of Europe, you actually find in different countries, different retailers, different car brands, different consumer durable brands are actually successful. So Siemens and Bosch are really successful in the consumer durables market in Germany, but Scandinavia, it's Electrolux, in this it's Italy. So, so then the complexity everybody understands at a conceptual level, but when you actually start putting it down, do you actually realize the diversity which is there in these two markets, and really to think of them as continents rather than as countries. The second piece is what I call, you have large markets. So, the 10 trillion is a great number. Even the current number of 3 trillion is a great number. But if you divide it by 2.4 billion people, you actually have many small transactions. And most people are actually used to having larger scale of operations, larger transaction size. So how do you make money when the average revenue per user is $2.50 for a cell phone user? How do you make money if your average deposit size or average loan size is very small? So how do you handle many large transactions? That's one thing. The second, and I love that ad. So on the right hand side you see this phone and it says iPhone, but there is between I and phone, I can afford this phone. So people want all the specifications, but they want it at an affordable price. So how do you actually capture this? And that's one of the critical things which makes winning in these markets difficult. So again, a question, what would you think is the largest food and beverage company in China? Any guesses? McDonald's. Kraft. Okay. KFC. Nestle, no. So I'm being mean, if the answer was simple, I wouldn't have asked this. Right? So it is a company called Tingyi. So across the world, so this is all the food and beverage companies in the world. If you look at the shareholder value creation from 2000 to 2010, Tingyi in that time period created $14 billion of shareholder value. The average return was about 40% per year. Today, the listed part of Tingyi is worth about $30+ billion. Its revenues in 2010 were 6.7 billion. In the next 2 years, it actually has crossed into double digit. PepsiCo had been in China for a fairly large time. Recently, it actually got into a joint venture, became a minority partner, and Tingyi actually is the dominant partner. So what do? They sell noodles, ramen, and the best-selling drink in China, which is ready-to-drink green tea. Right? And the story behind this, so we met one of the co-founders of Tingyi, and one of the things to remember is this company is about 20 years old. So he's a Taiwanese entrepreneur. He had been trying to do something else in China, did not work, and he was on this train, and he took out his packet of noodles, which was sort of homegrown, and everybody started coming. So as he says, in 1991, after encountering failures in launching products of egg rolls and cooking oil in China, I decided to come back to Taiwan, penniless and discouraged. On my returning trip, I took out my dinner on the train. I attracted the attention of all the passengers in the compartment. People were fascinated by the tasty smell of my food and so curious about where to buy similar products. What on earth was my dinner? It was just the instant noodle I brought from Taiwan. I sensed a huge business opportunity, and that was the start of Mastercom, that's the name of the noodle brand, and Tingyi. So for the first 10 odd years, it was just selling noodles, then ready to drink tea, then they've also now started restaurants, And the key thing inside that he said, on one hand, you had the cheap noodles which were available for the equivalent of 20 cents. On the other hand, you had the Maggi equivalent at 65 cents, which was very good, but it was expensive. And it is, the I can afford this iPhone phenomena. I came out with something which was good enough, but cheap enough. So priced it almost exactly half, set up the distribution, and then just conquered the market. You find similar stories of what people have been able to achieve in China, some in India. And I think the thing that we see common across people who've got this right is these four. So I think, and I'm taking a dig at consultants as well. Sometimes people outsource the job of knowing the consumer to somebody like a market research agency, a consultant, somebody junior in the organization. I believe, for example, this entire debate which is happening about FDI and retail, etc., is a very strange debate, because the best CRM is done by the local Kirana store. He knows you, he knows what you want, he's providing you doorstep delivery. If you want, he offers you credit. Which brand, which retailer can actually provide that? So knowing the consumer's up and personal, and I think that's one of the characteristics of entrepreneurs, companies, organizations that have been successful, is to really meet consumers up close and personal. The second is, it's very easy to say, China is the same and India and China are similar. In most global companies, China and India, at least till some time back, used to be mentioned in the same breath, no longer. And the fact is that's a gross oversimplification. There are many differences between the two countries, and it is good, it is wise to appreciate the differences. The third is the investment. The money and time part actually is the easy one. The talent is the difficult one. So if you ask any successful company, whether it is Indian, whether it is MNC, whether it is Chinese, the biggest constraint to growth that they would talk about is around finding people. And I find this amazing because, here you are sitting in a land of 1.2 billion people and 1.3 billion people respectively, and the biggest constraint that people talk about is talent. So, how does one reconcile the same? And that's something which, people need to figure out as to what needs to be done. And the fourth is, and I had a huge debate with my co-author on this. So somebody referred to him, in one of the discussions around Paisa Vasool, and he just loved the phrase. And he said, I'm going to make this phrase world famous. And I said, enough people know about it in India, so you don't need to make it world famous. He said, yes, but there are 350 million dumb Americans who don't get what this is. So I think it is what I would say, build the value approach in what you do. Getting the right balance. And I think if I was to just step back, it's not only about companies. I think it is about building this approach in everything, every enterprise, whether it's a social enterprise, whether it is a educational enterprise, whether it is a scientific enterprise, whether it is to look at a profit-making enterprise. How do we think about using the best from the resources that we have and getting the maximum return out of that, I think is going to be the biggest differentiators between what emerges from the West and what emerges from the East. Just one last thing. So, the one epilogue to this book is a chapter called Letter to the Next Generation. And this was intended to cater to a Western audience. And the letter talks about the next generation, people who are in their teens and early youth to say, wake up, there are kids in China and India who are poor, hungry and driven, and they will take your bread away. I'm just exaggerating for the sake of it. But it was a letter to the next generation of the West, asking them to do a set of things in order to be successful in the world of tomorrow. I actually can think of the same letter, and I think for many of the privileged class in India and China, the same letter holds true. So, if I was to tell my 10-year-old what to do, that's the letter that I would read to him. It's actually, available on iTunes as a podcast as well. So you can, for those who have an iPhone or a Mac, you can actually go to iTunes podcast Letter to the Next Generation and you can hear it as well. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Ritoshri, one small tip. I saw his card and it said Abhi, and I was getting confused because the V's and the V's amongst the Bengalis. And I said, how did you get this name Abhi? And apparently he was 7 months old before he got a name because no one gave him a name, and his father's friend who was a Bengali suggested Abhi, and that's how he got the name Abhi. Because I kept wondering, was the printing wrong or something? But I've got the answer for that. Okay, you've talked about 10 key messages in your book, and one of them was on local customization. Is that the reason you attribute to why you don't have too many multinationals successful both in China and India? Because they haven't got this?
So my personal belief is the reason why we don't see that is, 10 years back, subconsciously or consciously, most of the MNCs made a choice that they are going to tilt towards India or China. And they made that choice, and the fact is, in many of these categories, having an early mover advantage made a huge difference. I actually think, in the Indian context, LG is one company who's probably got a lot of it right around an MNC doing the local customization. And one of the things which is an interesting paradox for me is the Koreans probably have been the most successful MNCs in the Indian context. Whether you look at LG, Samsung, Hyundai, they have got something right. And I looked at them. I don't think it's that they had any specific science, etc. But this was the only market for them. The Chinese market, for LG had not worked out so well, so they didn't have a choice but to succeed.
Okay, going back to these 10 key messages that you talked about, you've covered it in your speech in your talk in various ways. But I think the group here would be interested in knowing the 10 key messages that you talked about in your book, very briefly, because that really tells a lot. There goes the book.
So, I'm sure I don't want to bore everybody with all 10, and one of the things that I learned was, if you tell an audience 10 things, they are not going to remember any. The 3 that I would say, I think the first is about knowing your consumer, your segment really deep and personal, number 1. Number 2 is many times that as people are making their decisions around what to do, I think the question is, are we taking too much risk? Will this really pan out? And I think the question to ask should actually be the other way around. If we don't make this investment, will we actually look back and say why we did not do that? So that's the second. The third, I would say, is get the most senior people in the organization into these markets. I think those are the 3 big messages. And just reflecting on what I had been doing. So I took some time off earlier this year from BCG, and I was wandering all over India. And one of the things I realized that even and I assume that's true for many people in this room, we don't know about 70% of India. rural India is, as a concept we understand, but it's a black box for many of us. So just going out there and knowing, and one of the things that I decided to do was to say, I'm not going to be a day tourist in some of these places. What I mean by that is, take a car, drive in the morning from Calcutta or Bombay or Jaipur, whichever place, spend a few hours and come back. But actually just stay in the village, spend the night there, and experience it firsthand. So experiencing it firsthand is the same as I would imagine for many companies is to actually spend time in the market.
Okay. The other one I had, again, one of your key messages was the 10 by 10. We grow 10 times in 10 years. Considering that India, 35% is urban, the rest is rural. Is rural India thinking 10 by 10? So, where does that put us in this $10 trillion prize?
So it's interesting. One of the people that we interviewed was Adi Godrej, and that's where the 10 by 10 thing came. And actually, if you look at it, 10 by 10 is very simple. It's actually only a growth of 26% every year. And I deliberately say only, and I just do the math around that. Let's assume that the economy grows at 7%, 8%. We have an inflation of 7%. So even if you're doing nothing, you are at 15%. So any company which is actually not growing its revenue at 15%, has a lot to think about. Many of the sectors related to the consumer economy are actually growing faster than that. So that 15 goes to 18, 20. And then you're talking about some incremental share. So that's the power on 10 by 10. The second is the sense of optimism in rural India is actually much higher than in urban India. Much higher.
And what would you attribute this to?
I think people have seen on the ground change happen. So, I'll tell you, there is this small village about 70 kilometers away from Jaipur called Jhag. 10 years back, there was nothing there. There was no school, there was no primary health clinic. There was half of the village, you couldn't grow anything because the water was, as they say in Hindi, khara. It was not useful for irrigation. In the last 10 years, there's a primary school and a secondary school. Road connectivity has increased. There's a primary health center where actually the doctor comes. And then you have employment generation happening, and you have this Bisalpur water line, which actually is getting water. So we put all this together, and this is not an isolated incident. Bihar, UP, Gujarat, Rajasthan, those are the 4 states that I went to because I decided I will go to a place where at least I can understand the local language. In all 4 states, in 25 plus villages, I saw the same thing again and again and again.
So you believe that this is also getting them to dream big?
Yes, and I think that's partly worrisome as well, because I think if we as a society and the government is not able to fulfill some of those aspirations, then the political, social disharmony that I talked about will be a big risk. And you already see parts of that happening. So I think that's something to worry about.
A little off your book, during your travels in Rajasthan and the villages, I can't remember the lady. Do you meet her? She's an MBA from the US, who's now a sarpanch in one of the villages. I can't remember her name. Do you remember?
Chavi.
Chavi.
Yeah. So she's actually an Aspen fellow as well.
Is she? Okay.
And yeah. So in fact, one of the villages that I went to was Soda.
Soda, that's right. Yeah.
So yes.
I just couldn't remember her name, but I've met her on a number of occasions. I found that interesting. Okay. I think there's going to be questions from them. I'll just give you two questions that I was curious about. One is, you've talked about the consumer spend. In China and India, in China it will be 6.1 something, India will be 3.5, almost double. China will be double. However, I find that you expect the middle class in China to, by 2020 to be 1 billion and for India to be 315 million. So we are talking about 1/3 the middle class population, but half the spend. So individually, you are talking about a higher spend of the middle class in India than in China. Is my understanding correct?
So the numbers are correct, but the total consumption, so the 6.2 trillion and the 3.6 trillion is for the entire population. So it's not only for the middle class.
Oh, it's for the...
It's for the entire population. So I think the interesting thing is what you find is, in India's case, is people are, what I would argue is people are moving from abject poverty to just about consumption levels in this time period, but not in the true middle class.
Okay.
While in China they would, let's say, be moving in the true middle class. One interesting thing is, one of the questions many people ask is, what's the difference between China and India in terms of number of years? And if you look at the infrastructure, it is probably 20 years or 30 years, whatever it is. But interestingly, you find that if you look at consumer economy or consumer spend, it's actually about an 8-year lag. Okay. So if you look at per capita consumption that Indians make, let's say, on cars or two-wheelers or phones or whatever, it's what China on a per capita basis did in 2005. So there's about a 7-8 year gap. And the more mass you go, the gap becomes lesser, so it's typically 5 years. The more luxury you go, it actually becomes 10-12 years. So China sold the same number of BMWs, Audis, Mercedes in 2002 as India did in 2012.
We'll throw it open for questions. Do you have another roaming mic?
Yes.
Well, although I have come late, I'm taking this opportunity to ask you the first question because Ritoshi put me here. But the good news, there's a good news and a bad news as well. The good news is that Ritoshi did a disservice to me by not saying that you were coming, that you have written a book and you are from Boston Consulting. Last week I was in New York and with my son-in-law Manish Kumar, and normally he gives me a book if somebody has written that. So I wish if it was there, but now I promise you I'll buy the book.
Thank you.
The bad news is, you have talked about a lot of optimism. I'm going to pose a few pessimistic questions. Now, first question is about China. Now, do you think the rate at which they're going? Now, India, after so many years, we are producing around 70 million tons of steel. They are producing probably 490 million. Taking over here, from here, there are all these. What about the sustainability? Although you mentioned a little bit, I think there's a moot question. What will happen to that? And I'm not going to the social aspect of it because I don't know whether all the China is prospering the same way or not. That could be a different question. But purely on the question of sustainability, there is a problem, it seems to be. The second question is that we are talking about, you have mentioned one point, that there's no sibling of this guy and even his father and things like that. But over a period of time, could there be aging population? And that would limit not only the consumption, but what is happening in Italy, things like that. They have got money to pay the pension, etc. Could there be a problem? The last one is, if you want to survive in the longer term, and you talked about producing goods which can be given in the Paisa Usul type of way, there's a need to innovate. Whether Chinese are innovating, whether they are doing that kind of thing, it is there or not there. And the last question is about India. A lot of us are making a good thing by saying that we have a demographic dividend. Now, Prime Minister is saying that we need 500 million people, skilled people. I wonder whether we start giving skills to so many people in such a big way, and if we can't provide them job, what would happen? That's how I feel the observation. Thank you.
I trust you don't have to tell me.
My name is, by the way,
He's in the educational.
I'm asking Bhattacharya from Globe Cinema.
I think it's linked to the issue around innovation. I don't think they have yet figured out the innovation part. So in some sense, somebody else has to innovate, they will industrialize. So, one of the potential scenarios could be that the US or Western Europe, as the case may be, actually becomes the innovation center and China becomes the industrial center. Just as an aside, so one point I have is, I think some of these facts about China are misreported. So out of the 490 million tons of steel which is being used, the fact is that, I don't know the exact number, but 150 million or thereabouts is actually being used for cars and products which are going to be used by the Western world, right? So the pollution in some sense is localized, but the use is actually, much broader. But it needs to be addressed absolutely. Second, aging absolutely. I think that's a big issue, and the fact that you don't have the equivalent of a healthcare, social security system actually is a big risk. And in fact, if you look at it, the reason why the Chinese savings rate, even after everything that has happened, is still in the early 30s, amongst the highest in the world along with India, for exactly the same reason, right? Which is people are saving for their old age. So I think that's going to happen. I think the Chinese actually have been fairly good in terms of saving for the future. So from a pure money perspective, they are fine at least for the next 20 years. And to the point around India, I think the demographic dividend is there, but if we don't use it, it's going to be a demographic disaster.
And if we can provide them jobs after that, it could be a different thing.
Yeah, so it's, the surgeon's knife, right? You can use it to do an operation, you can use it to kill. And the fact that we have, 75% of our population below the age of 35 is great. But this is also the population which is young and restless.
See, last time I bought the Chindia, so retrospectively I'll buy his book.
Sometimes these policies are usually guided by institutions of higher learning. And one of the institutions of higher learning are the schools of management. I just wanted to throw some light on the schools of management in China, vis-a-vis those that we have here, the leading ones. If you have some on the thinking of that and how that guides policy.
May I request you to introduce yourself?
My name is Vivek Kaul.
So, to be honest, specifically on the issue of business schools, I don't have a good perspective. We'd actually looked at the engineering schools across China and India and the US, and there's actually an entire chapter on education where we compare the asset value, investment into research, etc. amongst the top university in the US, in China and India, and you find India is far behind. China has made some progress. So if you look at from the last top 500 university report which came about 3 years back to the one which has come recently, you actually see 12 new Chinese universities get into the rank. India actually slips a couple of places. I think on the entire engineering side, I think China is doing a fantastic job. I think the innovation part is a question mark, but from an industrialization perspective, they are doing a fantastic job. One of the companies that we visited, somebody mentioned Huawei. We visited its campus and research facilities. Now, I know, there are many stories around, the Chinese army funding and so on and so forth. I don't know whether those are true or not. But just in terms of the pure infrastructure and the quality of talent which is there, it could be the next Silicon Valley, right? Minus the innovation and the other.
Any schools for entrepreneurship that are cultivated outside the business school paradigm there?
So here is my view. I don't think you can have a school for entrepreneurship.
That's true, but I'm saying there are centers that innovate and or facilitate incubation in some ways. Is that being practiced as a policy initiative?
I am not aware of that. It may be the case, but I have not come across that.
Because there's an interesting side that I wanted to share. I attended an international conference of the BRICS countries.
And the people from China, all the BRICS nations, People from China didn't get the visa to Bangalore and to come to India. So we had to have that on Skype. So just a food for thought.
Pradeep?
Yeah, I thought I heard a contradiction in the entire presentation, and it's probably because I didn't understand it, so I'd like clarification. You're saying that there's a $10 trillion prize, which is sort of, in marketing terms, it might be called the bait. But when I reach forward to listen to that prize, you tell me that no, it's not really $10 trillion prize, it's made up of several smaller pieces which you have to address individually. So in a sense, that's the switch. You're making an offer and when I reach for it, you're saying, no, it's not that, it's a lot more complicated. So my question is, are we making too much fuss about an unreachable numerical size of China and India, when in comparison the missed countries, Mexico and Turkey and South Korea, etc., that these might be much more deserving of attention in terms of easier business opportunity that can be tapped.
So, I think the point around the bait and switch, I think it is, the message was there is a large prize, but if you feel that, there's such a large prize, therefore you will just go and get it, it's not going to be easy. I think that's the point, and you really need to build it, state by state or city by city. I think to the point of the mist, I actually don't think those are easy pickings as well. South Korea is probably one of the most protected market across categories. No Western brand has been successful in establishing presence in either automobiles or consumer durables or retail or FMCG. So, South Korea, to my mind, actually, it's a very closed economy in some sense. It's not easy for a new player to go and win there. Mexico, the same thing. It's been there for a long time, nearby the US. But if you look at what's happening on the telecom side, the richest man in the world is there because, and we talk about crony capitalism in India and China. It's there as well. Otherwise, he would not have made the monies that he did. So I don't think it's easy in any of these markets. It's just that the difficulties are of different types.
Siddhant?
I loved the presentation. You talked briefly about the risks, and I was wondering if you had a chance, because the book maybe was written 2 or 3 years ago. Shale gas is supposed to move manufacturing back to the US because it will lower energy costs. How sensitive is the Chinese economy to manufacturing shifting out, either because of shale gas or because innovations in 3D printing and sort of custom-made bespoke manufacturing practices that are emerging?
I think that's a great question. Actually, a couple of my colleagues around the same time wrote a fairly controversial report around the renaissance of US manufacturing before it became fashionable to talk about the same. And they actually talked about one other driver along with the shale gas, etc., which is the fact that if you look at the western seaboard of the US, which is the primary receiver of goods, it's actually logjam. So the port of Los Angeles actually cannot take too much more from China. So there's actually a natural barrier to how much more can come from China till the western seaboard gets its act together in terms of ports. But I think we've actually looked at the analysis. So if you look at the Chinese manufacturing base, it's about 25% of that which is quote unquote at risk. Things like furniture, some parts of chemicals, and so on. But there's actually a large part, apparel, shoes, components, etc., which actually, even after the increase in Chinese labor rates, shale gas, etc., it would still make sense to go from China. The second is, if you look at the Chinese market itself, that's becoming a larger and larger component. So, already, I'm sure many people in the room know this. If you look at the car market, the Chinese car market, is bigger than most other markets and will soon rival the US. So I think the domestic market of China is going to start consuming.
So these are two or three observations arising from your talk, which I'd like to place before you for your clarification. One is, you said you are stunned by the importance to education which the country is giving today. So a few days ago, I went to a talk by Dr. Amartya Sen at his book release at London, where he echoed the exact opposite view, where he said that our importance to education is abysmally low, and if we want to progress, it has to be increased, the outlay. So maybe from the government point of view.
So clarify, what I said, it was people pay a huge importance to education. What our country does or the state does is a separate issue.
Okay. No, I'm just telling you, okay. Then the next thing you said is, you spoke about the burgeoning middle class, and the assumptions for that was, you said that you are taking a growth rate of 6 to 7% and an inflation rate of 7%, 7 to 8%. On these figures, on these facts, assumptions, you worked out this figure. But sir, if this postulate stands, the two pull in opposite directions. If inflation is 7 to 8%, government, RBI has to take anti-inflationary measures which would pull down the growth rate. And then another demon that has appeared in the horizon today is RBI's primary objective is to stabilization of the rupee, which is a new demon that has appeared, which was not there. So the two are pulling in opposite directions. So one of them, obviously, whichever the priority is afforded, the other thing will fall down. While at present growth seems to be taking a back seat. The other two are apparently taking a priority. And the third point I'd like to say is that FICCI also has recently done a study on this $10 trillion prize. Have you seen it? I mean, are you aware of it? Because this suddenly, in the last few months, this kind of interest has burgeoned. Over the past few years, I've been attending so many seminars, this kind of thing has not, this kind of topics have not emerged. Suddenly I find, so any particular reason for this emergence of this, if you could highlight it.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. So on a lighter note, I'd like to think that imitation is the best form of flattery. So I don't, but on a more serious note, I don't know why, FICCI or anyone else has come out with the same. If I was to just think on my feet, I think one reason could be that right now, if you look at growth opportunities in many parts of the world, it's actually not there. And therefore, if you look at, even at a slowdown in China and India, it still represents a fair increase. So that's
Europe is negative growth.
Yeah. The second, and again, just to clarify, what I was referring to the 6, 7, and 10 was to put in contrast the 10 by 10 and the 26% growth figure, which leads to the same numbers. In the book, and we've got the details in the appendix, we've actually taken it as a factor of 3 different things. So one is the economic growth. The second, which actually is a big driver of this change, is what happens on the savings rate or consumption rate. Because at a household level, if you look at over the last few years, the savings rate actually has come down. And over this 10-year period, we have assumed that there is going to be a decline in savings rate of about 0.3% 0.2% over this period. So that's one driver. If you look at the exact assumptions around growth and GDP, it's around 5 and 5.5% for inflation, and about 7% for GDP growth rate. So, you know, and you're right. You know, if one goes, then the other one is going to impact the same.
Even on growth, if you analyze over the past few years, growth is per se is no problem for us. It's a tremendous plus point. The Western world would give the right hand to get our rate of growth. But if the point is does that trickle down to the lowest level doesn't happen, is not happening here, but it is happening elsewhere. Would you like to comment on that?
You know, I think there are two very able economists who are, you know, debating on that issue. I don't think I would be able to add too much light on that.
I am Indrajit from Anandabazar Patrika, Business and Finance. Just here I'm not as a journalist or to put a headline onto your article. Just one small question from my side. It's you have mentioned that the consumption is going to be 19-fold plus for Indian child who is born in 2009, and for China it's 38 times or so. My question is, what will be the savings rate? What exactly you were mentioned about? Because I'm just quoting Professor Stiglitz or many other economists. They pointed out that just before the doom in 2008, for last 25-30 years, US also viewed similar kind of, you know, spending spree, middle class squeezed. Actually, their real income came down, but many of the families actually consumed 110% to 120% of their consumption, which came down the asset bubble and put together all the economic. So what's going to be, what is the sustainability in India?
So our assumption is actually fairly conservative. So we've taken, for example, in China, over this time period, a 2% decline in savings rate. So you are actually going from 33% to 31%, which will still be amongst the highest in the world. And if you look at the growth itself, you know, for China, we have actually taken a growth of beyond 2020. We've taken a growth of about 3.5%. Right. So, you know, my personal view is there is potentially some upside which is sitting on top of this, about these numbers. And, you know, the fact still remains that the average in India, even in 2020, is going to be about 1/10 of the US. So, you know, we still have, you know, a huge ground to cover.
Good evening. I'm Srila Mitro from the Millennium Mams. It's an NGO and we do financial education for women. So my question is, this $10 trillion story unfolds, and for that we have to take for granted that the demographic dividend is, we reap the value of the demographic dividend and it doesn't convert to a demographic disaster. So I'd just like to ask, I mean, your opinion that, you know, just as a layperson that I read the papers, it's very frightening. There's the current account deficit, there's, you know, such high inflation. And more than that, there's a huge trust deficit in the political scenario. So how, in your opinion, what would be the key ways to try and convert this demography into a proper demographic dividend? How could we avert the disaster?
He'd be sitting in the PMO's office.
Yeah. So, see, I have an answer. I don't know whether it is right. See, I think investment in social infrastructure, whether it is education, whether it is healthcare, you know, is critical. My personal view is, and see many people justifying additional government expenditure, let's say whether it's in education, whether it's on health, whether it's on security, whatever, you know, they will say, you know, US is X%, we are so low, X country is Y%, we are so low, and so on and so forth. It seems easy to say, you know, increase spends on education, social infrastructure, etc., etc. The question to which I don't have an answer is, where do you get that money from?
Can we take a leaf out of China's book? I mean, anything we can learn from them, since you've studied.
So, you know, the one interesting thing, and in China, the women workforce participation is very high. Women education and literacy levels are also very high. And as we were doing the research, the one thing which I got to know was, if you look at, it's even pre-1980. So, actually some of the investment in educational infrastructure, etc., actually predated even the launch of the reforms, right? And the last 30 years, they have reaped the benefits of those reforms, which just by the nature of the kind of reforms have long gestation periods, right? So I think even if we make investments in education and healthcare and so on, I actually don't think we're going to see the benefits in the next 8 years. We're probably going to see it in the decade of 2020 and 2030. And see, that's what makes it difficult, right? So, the finance minister or the prime minister don't have an easy job because, it's, do you invest for the next 8 years? Do you invest for the 10 years beyond that? And that's a really critical question. I think on a personal note, and I was having this discussion with one of my friends. So he's done some very rough rule of thumb. He said, if you just go by what the reported income tax figures are, right? So there are 40,000 people who have an income of greater than 1 crore. This is as per the income tax. In reality, I'm sure the number is higher. If in reality, let's say assume 2 lakh people have this, right? If 2 lakh people have this income wealth, and if they can make a difference in their community, whichever community that they are talking about, that would actually make a huge difference. And if you look at the amount, just in terms of pure subsidy, and this is an idea that he's chasing, is to say, use these wealthier individuals to route the government subsidy through and make them accountable, these 200,000 people, accountable for the set of, let's say, 200 people that they have to take care of. And, provide tax benefits, part government, etc., etc., etc. So, if you really think about it, it is looking at a much decentralized level of imparting and ensuring that this leakage does not happen. It's impractical, yes.
That would be a Herculean task.
Yeah.
I believe there's one more question, and okay, we'll take 2, one here and one there. Just let him finish.
Myself, Ravi Tatia, proud member of Young Indians. As an entrepreneur, out of curiosity and out of value, since you have traveled so long and researched a lot into China and India, one question or one explanation that I would like to have from you: what value does the Chinese give to a Made in India tag, and what perception value change you are seeing in Indian entrepreneurs in Made in India tag?
Sorry, could you repeat? What value does
the Chinese give to a Made in India product, and how Indian entrepreneurs are changing it to Made in India tag?
Great question. So I'll answer it slightly in a roundabout way. In one of the talks that I was giving, there was a European who stood up and said that, he was a Frenchman. He said, you've been talking about China, you've been talking about US, you've even been talking about India. You've forgotten us Frenchmen. You've forgotten us Europeans. And I think many Chinese don't think about India. So my co-author made a comment which I didn't like, but he said, this book will do very well in India because Indians like to be in the same bracket as China. China is thinking about being in the same bracket as the US. So, we are, as much as it hurts me to say that, I don't think we are on the radar.
Mr. Basu.
My name is Shonjit Basu. Question is, I think you've taken largely a rate of growth perspective. if you were to look at it from a more structural perspective, I was just wondering, this $10 trillion amount is the aggregate of consumption spending in India and China. What would the amount be for the rest of the world? And what is, how does that contrast with the population of the two countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
That's a great question. So if you look at the US economy alone, it is close to $15 trillion today. If you look at the 19x and the 38x that I talked about in the same time period for the US, it's expected to be about 3.5x. But the fact remains that US will probably still be 10 times more wealthy than India. So if you just do the math, the number for the US, let's say in 2020, is going to be 25 or 20 trillion at least, 20 trillion roughly. I'm just doing a little bit of mental math. So it will still be, the single largest market. China potentially could overtake it at some point of time in the, late 20s, early 30s. But till then, that's going to be the largest economy.
No, that's fine. But what I'm saying is that the population of India, China together, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and India, China, 10 trillion, vis-a-vis the consumption of the rest of the world, do you think that there is getting to be a more proportional?
Yeah, so see the only risk with that is, so the numbers will pan out to be, about 35% of the population and about 20% of the consumption. But the fact is, you also have the, the 1 billion plus, let's say, of sub-Saharan or of Africa, which will be much lower. So, on an average, it will be much higher in many parts of the world.
How did you adjust for inflation?
I'm sorry?
In those figures, how did you adjust for inflation?
So I'm happy to discuss it offline. I'm sure half the audience will fall to sleep as we get into the details of the same.
We thank you very much. I just wanted to make a comment. You were talking about 40,000 people pay over a crore rupees. I'm told in the corner of the city you live in that corner, there are more than 40,000 people.
Yeah. That's the reported number, income tax.
So some fascinating facts, some powerful portrayals and keen insights. Abhik, I think you've whet their appetite just enough. Thank you for that, and thank you for being in Kolkata today. Hope to see you more often in the future. Mr. Mojumdar, as always, thank you so much for skillfully chairing this, and mostly also for hosting this evening. Thank you very much, and we hope to have you involved with many more Aspen India events going forward. Thank you for being here. The audience is what makes an interaction, certainly an interaction, and we're always open for thoughts, suggestions for events going forward. So thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you.